The Keth'Var Military Academy had been producing officers for 4,217 years. Not soldiers, officers. There is a difference, and the distinction matters more than most species ever bother to understand. Soldiers follow orders. Officers understand why the orders exist, and more importantly, they understand what to do when the orders stop making sense. Keth'Var had spent 4 millennia refining that understanding into a curriculum, and the curriculum into a reputation, and the reputation into something that functioned less like a school and more like a galactic institution, a fixed point, a certainty. 41 species had sent students through Keth'Var's programs over the centuries. 41 species had returned home with officers who thought more clearly, commanded more effectively, and died less frequently than the ones who had not attended. The Academy's graduation rate was 61%, brutal by most standards, celebrated by theirs. You did not graduate from Keth'Var by being good enough. You graduated by being the kind of officer the galaxy did not produce on its own. The campus occupied the entirety of Veth Station, a purpose-built orbital platform above the cold gray planet. Keth'Var Prime, chosen 3,000 years ago because the planet below offered nothing of comfort and everything of perspective. You could look down at those gray stone continents and flat iron seas and understand at a cellular level that the universe did not care whether you were ready. It simply arrived. Your job was to be ready anyway. Commandant Saravel Doss had run the academy for 19 years. She was Veth tall, silver-skinned, with the particular stillness of a species that had evolved in environments where movement attracted predators. She did not fidget. She did not rush. She had seen every variety of student the galaxy produced, had graduated some of them, and returned the rest to their home worlds with documentation that was thorough and not unkind. She had seen brilliance, and she had seen catastrophic failure, and she had seen, most commonly, the vast middle territory of students who were capable but not exceptional. She had never seen anything that surprised her. She would later say in the classified debrief that followed the events of what her staff quietly began calling the 14 incident that she should have paid more attention to the intake forms. She should have read them more carefully. She should have, at minimum, asked someone who had actually been to Earth. The human exchange program had not been her idea. It had emerged from the Keth'Var Diplomatic Annex, the branch of the Academy's administration responsible for managing the political relationships that kept the institution's funding stable and its reputation untouchable. The annex operated on a simple principle. If a species felt included in the Keth'Var project, they were less likely to cause problems for the Keth'Var project. Exchange students were one tool among many. They were also, in the annex's private assessment, rarely the point. The humans had been offered 3 seats in the current cohort as part of a broader treaty package, one that had more to do with mining rights in a disputed belt, 2 sectors away than with any genuine interest in human military development. The annex had recommended acceptance. The humans were new to galactic politics, still finding their footing, and inclined to interpret gestures of inclusion as meaningful ones. It was the annex liaison had written in his recommendation memo, a low-cost goodwill investment with negligible operational impact. Commandant Doss had approved it without a second reading. It was just a training exercise after all. Simulation coordinator Ethran Moss had been given the humans' intake files approximately 4 days before they arrived. He had reviewed them the evening before their orientation, which was how he reviewed most intake files, thoroughly enough to know what he was working with, not so thoroughly that he wasted time on students who would sort themselves out in the first assessment week. He had noted the following about the 3 human students. First, they were physically unremarkable by Galactic standards. Average height, moderate muscle density. No biological advantages worth cataloging, no natural armor, no enhanced sensory systems, no redundant organ structures. One of them had a documented injury history that would have disqualified him from the programs of at least 6 other species academies. Keth'Var's intake criteria did not discriminate on physical grounds, so Moss had noted this and moved on. Second, their academic records were solid. Not exceptional. Solid. They had attended their species' own military training institutions before the exchange program, one from something called Fort Benning, one from a naval officer program, one from a special operations selection course that Moss had no external reference point for evaluating. He had filed that last one under miscellaneous and continued. Third, they had listed in the section of the intake form that asked for prior combat experience a combined total that Moss had initially assumed was a data entry error. He had flagged it for clarification, and then, when the clarification came back confirmed, had set the file down and looked at the ceiling of his office for a long moment. Then he had decided that combat experience from a species that had only recently achieved interstellar travel was probably not directly comparable to the kind of experience the question was designed to assess. He had moved on. His assistant, a young Veth named Sercal, in only her second year on the simulation coordination team, had asked him the next morning whether the human files raised any particular considerations for the simulation design. Moss had said no. From the doorway, another voice had offered an opinion without being asked. Cadet Senior Instructor Veltar On was not technically part of Moss's team. He was attached to the Academy's assessment faculty responsible for the cohort's academic performance evaluations, not the simulation itself. But he had a habit of appearing in the monitoring center during scenario briefings that Moss had long since stopped trying to discourage, and he had clearly read the intake files himself because he said, without looking up from his own data slate, I reviewed the human records this morning. Average profiles, the combat experience. Numbers are almost certainly inflated. Their home administration documents are not always calibrated to Galactic reporting standards. I wouldn't weight them. He said this with the particular confidence of a person who was accustomed to being right and had not yet encountered a situation that challenged the habit. Moss had agreed. Sercal had said nothing. She had, however, made a quiet note in her own files, not about the humans, about the combat experience numbers, and about the special operations selection course that nobody had a reference point for. She had filed it under review after scenario. The 3 humans arrived on a standard transit shuttle, unremarkable in every visible way. The first was a woman named Reyes. She was 31 years old, dark-eyed, with the particular quality of stillness that Moss would later realize he had misread entirely. He had interpreted it as calm. It was not calm. It was the specific attentiveness of a person who was cataloging everything in a room and had simply learned not to let that process show on her face. She walked through the docking bay corridor with her hands loose at her sides and her gaze moving in a pattern that was too systematic to be casual. Not looking at things, reading them, the access panels, the junction markers, the emergency designation codes stenciled at the base of each bulkhead. She read them the way someone else might read signage, automatically, continuously, filing it without appearing to notice she was doing it. The second was a man named Okoro. He was 34, broad through the shoulders with a way of moving through a space that made him seem simultaneously unhurried and already exactly where he needed to be. He smiled easily, the kind of smile that put people at ease, which was either a natural quality or a very practiced one, and Okoro was the kind of person who made it difficult to determine which. He asked questions about the station layout in a tone that suggested polite curiosity. He remembered every answer. When the escorting officer mentioned, offhandedly, that the lower deck's maintenance cycles ran on a 6-hour stagger, Okoro had nodded and smiled. Cadet Instructor Veltar was observing the arrival. From the upper corridor walkway, standard faculty practice for new cohort intake. He watched the 3 humans cross the docking bay floor and then said to the junior faculty member standing beside him, "Physically, they're exactly what the files suggested. I expect they'll cluster in the middle of the cohort rankings, perhaps lower, given the unit size." He paused, watching Vok pause very slightly at a ventilation grate in the corridor. While the small one looks distracted, the junior faculty member had agreed. Neither of them had looked at what Vok was actually listening to. Moss conducted the orientation himself. He explained the simulation program, the Academy's crown achievement, a fully immersive battlefield scenario system that used the station's lower decks as a physical environment and overlaid it with dynamic scenario parameters managed by his team from the monitoring center above. The simulation had been running for 260 years. It had been used to assess more than 12,000 students across 41 species. The scenario parameters were sophisticated enough to model 900 distinct battlefield situations. The system tracked over 400 individual performance metrics. The results were, without exception, the most reliable predictor of officer quality the galaxy had ever produced. He had said this with the quiet pride of a man who genuinely believed it. Veltar sat in the rear of the orientation room, data slate open, reviewing his own assessment rubric. He was not particularly listening. He had heard the orientation briefing many times. He glanced up once, noted the 3 humans arranged at the front table, Reyes with her hands folded, Okoro with his easy attentiveness, Vok looking at the wall panel to the left of the main display, and returned to his slate. He would later say he had not paid attention during the orientation because there had been no reason to. He would not say this with the same confidence he had previously brought to most of his statements. Reyes listened to the entire briefing with complete stillness, not the stillness of someone absorbing information passively, the stillness of someone running calculations behind their eyes while their face gave nothing away. Beside her, Okoro caught her eye once, the briefest contact, and she gave the smallest tilt of her head. That Moss, watching the room, registered as nothing, and Serkal, watching from the doorway, filed away as something. At the end of the orientation, Moss asked if there were any questions. He expected the standard questions: how long the simulation would run, how scoring worked, whether physical injury was possible within the scenario parameters. Reyes looked up from the table and asked a single question: "Are there any rules?" Moss paused. It was an unusual framing. Not "what are the rules? Are there any?" He smiled. He explained that the simulation was designed to model real battlefield conditions, and real battlefields did not have rules, only outcomes. The scenario had parameters, physical boundaries, a defined objective, a time limit, but within those parameters, students were free to approach the problem however they chose. That freedom was the entire point. The simulation was designed to see what students did when the structure was removed. He said this with confidence because it was true, and because he had said it many times before, and because it had always been the right answer. Reyes nodded slowly. Koro glanced at Vok. Vok was looking at the wall panel. From the rear of the room, Veltar did not look up from his data slate. He had already categorized the question as a translation artifact. The humans were new enough to Galactic protocol. That imprecise phrasing was expected. Reyes heard Moss's answer and understood it completely. She understood it more completely than Moss did. She turned it over once in her mind, looked at the infrastructure, documentation sitting in the corner of her orientation package that nobody had told her was relevant, and began. That night, 6 hours before the simulation launched, the three humans sat in their shared quarters and said very little for a very long time. Okoro had the station's infrastructure documentation open on his device, not the scenario materials. The infrastructure documentation, the kind of document that detailed atmospheric cycling schedules, power, load distribution across deck sections, maintenance, access routing for service technicians, the kind of document nobody thought to restrict, because nobody had ever needed to. Reyes was drawing on her forearm with a stylus. Not a diagram exactly, a notation system, spatial references, junction codes, flow paths. Okoro had once asked her why she used her forearm instead of a surface she could erase. She had said that a surface you can erase is a surface you can lose. Your arm goes where you go. Vok was lying on his bunk with his eyes closed. He was not sleeping. Okoro knew this because Vok's breathing when he slept was different from his breathing when he was thinking, and right now, Vok was thinking, had been thinking since the ventilation grate in the corridor outside the orientation room. Okoro had heard the grate, had clocked the dimensions automatically, a habit from too many enclosed spaces in too many unfamiliar buildings. Vok had heard something inside it. 6-hour maintenance cycle, Okoro said quietly, without looking up. Staggered, Reyes said, not looking up either, which means the lower deck cycle runs offset from the upper by about 90 minutes. A silence. The ventilation distribution junction, Vok said from the bunk, eyes still closed. It's on deck 4. Junction point for the whole lower section. A pause. The ducts are large enough. Okoro looked at Reyes. Reyes finished the notation she was making on her arm. They told us there are no rules, she said. They told us there are only outcomes, Okoro said. Vok opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling. Then let's talk about outcomes. They talked until 0300. They were not loud about it. They never were. This was not a quality they had developed for the academy. This was simply how they worked, quietly, thoroughly, in the specific register of people who had learned that the loud version of a plan was the version that got people killed. By the time they finished, Reyes had run out of forearm and moved to the inside of her wrist. Okoro had closed the infrastructure document because he no longer needed it open. Vok had gone to sleep. Actually sleep this time. Okoro recognized the breathing. Reyes sat for another 20 minutes alone, looking at the notation on her arm. Then she smiled, small and private, and entirely to herself, and went to bed. The simulation launched at 0600 station time. The scenario was Designation 14, one of the standard mid-complexity scenarios used for mixed cohort assessments. The objective was straightforward. Locate and capture the command node in Sector 7 of the lower decks, hold it against a simulated counter-assault force for 6 hours, then extract through the designated corridors before the scenario's time limit expired. 14 was not the hardest scenario in the library. It was not designed to be. It was designed to establish a baseline to see how students organized themselves under pressure, how they allocated resources, how they communicated, and how they responded when their Initial plan stopped working. Every student's initial plan stopped working in 14. That was built into the scenario. The point was not whether the plan survived. The point was what happened after it didn't. The current cohort was 47 students across 11 species, divided into operational units of 5 to 7 members each by Moss's team. The humans had been placed together in a unit of 3, smaller than standard but unavoidable given their enrollment numbers. Veltaran was in the monitoring center for the launch, his standard practice on simulation day 1. He watched the displays as 44 of the 47 students began moving immediately toward the Sector 7 objective. He watched the Theric unit execute a 2-element corridor split that he had annotated as sophisticated before the first 10 minutes were done. Then he found the human unit on display 7. They had not moved. "Coordinator," he said, "the human unit appears to be stationary." "I see them," Moss said. "They've been stationary for 4 minutes." "I know." Veltaran looked at the display. The humans were standing in the staging area. The woman, Reyes, appeared to be writing something on her forearm. The larger man, Okoro, was speaking quietly. The small one, Vok, had his eyes closed. "They appear to be having a conversation," Veltaran said. "Yes. The scenario has been active for 4 minutes." Moss said nothing. "They're going to fall behind the cohort's positional curve before they've even begun," Veltaran said. He made a note on his assessment slate. "I'll mark this as hesitation under pressure. It's not uncommon for exchange cohorts in their first scenario exposure." Sercal, at her station, did not say anything. On display 7, the human unit moved. They did not move toward Sector 7. They moved toward the maintenance corridors. Sercal flagged it within 60 seconds. The maintenance corridors were not part of the scenario. They were service passages, utility infrastructure, empty of scenario elements, not on the student map, not connected to any objective. No student in 260 years had entered them because the maintenance corridors were not where the objective was. "They've entered the maintenance section," Sercal said. Veltaran looked up from his slate. "That's the wrong direction entirely." "Yes. The objective is Sector 7. "Yes." He watched the display for a moment. "They're confused. The unit size is too small for an effective reconnaissance element. They can't split off a scout while maintaining any kind of operational presence. They'll realize the corridor leads nowhere and self-correct within the next 10 minutes. He made another note. Sercal said nothing. She was pulling the full deck schematic, not the scenario schematic, the actual station infrastructure layout. She was running her finger along the maintenance corridor network on her secondary display, tracing connections, counting junctions. "Coordinator," she said quietly. Moss came to her station. "The maintenance corridors connect to 11 different deck sections," she said, "through service access points that aren't on the student map. Not because anyone hid them. Pause. Because nobody ever needed them." Moss looked at the schematic. He looked at the human unit's position on display 7. He looked back at the schematic. "Where does the network reach?" he asked. "Everywhere," Sercal said. "All 4 active scenario decks, the opposition staging area, the power relay clusters, the ventilation, distribution junction, a silence. "They went in knowing that," Moss said. "Not a question. The infrastructure documentation was in the orientation package," Sercal said. "Standard inclusion. It's never been relevant before." On display 7, Reyes stopped at a junction point and checked her forearm. Then she turned left toward the ventilation distribution junction, and Vok moved ahead of her without being told, already reaching for the access panel. What is he doing? Veltaron said, watching the same feed. That's a ventilation system. Yes, Moss said. Why is he touching the ventilation system? Moss said nothing. He did not know yet, but the particular feeling forming in his chest was the feeling of a man who was beginning to suspect that the question was not why is he touching it, but what does he already know about it? By hour 2, Sercal had stopped narrating what she was seeing and started simply documenting it, because narrating it required language and she was not certain the language she had was adequate. In the time since entering the maintenance corridors, the human unit had done the following. Reyes had mapped, by hand, every service access point on the lower 4 decks, cross-referencing her forearm notation against the infrastructure documentation that Okoro was supplying from memory, walking beside her with his hands in his pockets as though they were touring a facility and not systematically learning the skeleton. She had also, Sercal noticed, marked 3 corridor junction points with small physical indicators, subtle notches made with the stylus at a consistent height, an angle on the wall panels, not randomly. The 3 junctions with the broadest access to the largest number of student unit positions. She filed this observation separately in a folder. She labeled, "Not yet understood." Okoro had located the power relay cluster for the lower deck lighting grid and the specific relay points where the scenario's simulation weapon emitter system drew power. He had spent 11 minutes examining them. He had not touched them. He had looked at them with the careful attention of a person pricing something before deciding whether to buy it. Then he had photographed them in his memory and walked away. Sercal did not understand why he had walked away. She would, within the hour. Vok had spent 41 minutes at the ventilation distribution junction making adjustments to the control interface's maintenance subsystem that her monitoring software could register as activity, but could not decode in detail. The junction managed atmospheric flow for the entire lower deck network. What Vok was adjusting within it was in a layer of the system that the simulation sensors had never needed to look at because no student had ever touched it. He had also at one point held perfectly still, with his ear against the main distribution duct, for approximately 4 minutes. Then he had nodded once privately to himself and continued working. What is he doing? Veltaron said. He had been watching display 7 for 20 minutes. His assessment notes had stopped. He had the expression of a man whose carefully organized understanding of a situation was developing. A small crack it could not immediately explain. I'm not certain, Sercal said. He's been at the ventilation junction for 40 minutes. Yes. It's not a scenario element. No. There's nothing there that relates to the objective. Sercal looked at her secondary display, where she had been quietly building a map of every location the human unit had visited, where they had paused, how long, what systems they had examined. She looked at the map for a moment. Then she said very quietly, I think they aren't going to the objective. Veltaron turned to look at her. That's not possible, he said. The scenario has one objective. There is nothing else to do. Sercal did not respond. She saved the map to her secondary drive and opened a new file. On display 7, the human unit finished in the maintenance corridors and began to move, not toward Sector 7. Sercal tracked their heading against the deck schematic. Coordinator, she said. Moss came to her station. She pointed at the display. Moss looked at it. He looked at the schematic. He sat down in the nearest chair. Get Senior Instructor Vale, he said. The human unit emerged from the maintenance corridors at 9:14 station time. They emerged directly behind the opposition force's primary staging position in Sector 6. The staging position was in the scenarios, architecture, the enemy's safe zone, the organizational hub from which the counterassault force coordinated all activity against whatever position the student units established in Sector 7. It was deep inside opposition-controlled territory. It had never been approached by a student unit because there was no logical approach route, except through Panel 7G in the eastern wall, which backed onto a service corridor that connected to the maintenance network, which the student map did not show, which the infrastructure documentation did. The monitoring system registered the 3 humans emerging from the service panel, the opposition forces. Automated sensors did not register them for 4 seconds because the sensor parameters had been calibrated for student approach from the Sector 7 corridor network, not from inside the wall. For seconds, Koro was through the door and moving toward the communication relay before the sensors completed their recalibration sweep. He did not run. That was the thing Serkel would remember later. She had expected urgency, and what she saw instead was precision. He moved exactly as fast as the task required and not faster, because faster introduces error, and Okoro did not deal in error. He took the communication relay offline in 3 seconds with the particular efficiency of a man who had identified the correct component from 11 minutes of looking at a relay cluster an hour earlier, and had simply been waiting to use the Reyes moved left, the equipment depot. She assessed it in 5 seconds, her eyes moving in the same reading pattern that had cataloged the docking bay corridor on arrival, and made 2 decisions in those 5 seconds that Serkel would only fully understand when she reviewed the footage 6 hours later. First decision: she did not take everything. She took specific items, calculated quantities, not for themselves, for distribution. Second decision: she took one piece of opposition equipment that was not a weapon, and not a supply item. It was a signal emitter, a component of the opposition forces' identification broadcasting system. She looked at it for a moment, turned it over. Then she put it in her pocket and moved on. Vok went to the ceiling. Not metaphorically. He located the ceiling panel above the staging room's primary systems hub, removed it with tools he had found in the maintenance corridors, and disconnected the opposition force emitter array's primary power coupling with the focused attention of a man who had been planning this specific action since he first listened to the ventilation duct outside the orientation room. The opposition force could now fire all they wanted. Nothing would register. In the monitoring center, the room had gone very quiet. Veltar-On was standing with his assessment slate hanging loosely at his side. He was looking at the display without making notes. He was not making notes because the rubric he had prepared did not have a category for what he was watching. "They're not attacking the opposition force," he said. Came out almost as a question. "No," Serkel said. They're dismantling it." No one responded. "They didn't go for the node," he said. "They went for the system that makes the node matter." He looked at Moss. "They aren't trying to win 14. "No," Senior Instructor Vale said, from the doorway where she had arrived 3 minutes before and had not yet spoken. She walked into the room. "They aren't. They're trying to change what winning inside 14 means." She stopped beside Moss's station and looked at the display. "The question is what they plan to do next." On display 7, Reyes came out of the equipment depot. She had the signal emitter in one hand and the stylus in the other. She was already working on the emitter. "What is she doing to that component?" Veltaron asked. It took Sercal 8 minutes to work out the answer. When she did, she set her data slate down on the desk carefully and said, "She's modifying it." Into what? Into a device that will make her read to the scenario's automated tracking system as an opposition force unit. A silence that had a specific texture to it. "That's impossible," Veltaron said. "She has the component," Sercal said. "She knows the scenario's sensor parameters. From the orientation documentation, she has the technical background from her file." A pause. "It's not impossible. It just required someone to look at an opposition piece of equipment and see what else it could be." On the display, Reyes finished her modification, checked it again, and then, in a gesture so small and so human that Sercal almost missed it, held it up for Okoro to see. Okoro looked at it. He looked at her. He grinned. Not a victory grin. The quieter kind. The grin of two people who have worked toward something for a long time and have just confirmed it is going to work. The grin of genuine partnership. Reyes allowed herself approximately half a second of it. Then she pocketed the device and turned toward the staging room's service panel. She had work to do. By hour 3, Okoro had built a command center in the enemy's staging room. Not figuratively, literally. He had taken the opposition force's own coordination equipment, functional, powered, still connected to the scenario student communication network, despite the relay being offline because the relay controlled outbound opposition communication, and Okoro had been careful about which cable he pulled and connected it to a different feed. Specifically, he had connected it to the scenario's student communication system, which meant he now had in a room the scenario considered opposition territory, a real-time picture of every student unit's position, status, and open communication. The same picture Moss had in the monitoring center, except Moss had been using it for assessment and Okoro was using it for logistics. He built a triage map. Each student unit's supply status cross-referenced against their position, their distance from the corridor network, and their projected resource depletion curve. He ran it against the 6-hour maintenance cycle timing that he had filed away from the escorting officer on the walk from the docking bay. Then he identified 4 units, not the strongest ones, the ones in the most structural difficulty, the units whose positions were sound, but whose supply situations were going to fail them before the scenarios midpoint, the units that were going to lose not because they made poor decisions but because the scenario had given them a resource curve they could not solve from inside the scenario's own parameters. He marked them on his map. Then he called Reyes on the ventilation system. The ventilation communication system was Vox. It was also, Sercal determined after 90 minutes of analysis, completely unmonitorable by any sensor the Academy had installed, because it operated not as a signal but as a physical vibration pattern in the duct material itself. Low frequency, deliberate rhythm, code. If you knew the pattern and you had your hand on the right junction point, you could feel it, like a pulse, like someone knocking very quietly on the bones of the station. It transmitted over the entire lower deck ventilation network, which meant it reached every section of the scenario simultaneously, which meant Vok positioned at the main junction could communicate with Reyes anywhere in the lower decks with no signal that any monitoring system would ever see. He built a communication network, Sercal said. She had been staring at the sensor data for 20 minutes. Inside the simulation, using the station's own infrastructure. That we cannot monitor, Vale said. That we cannot monitor. Sercal confirmed. Veltar had put his assessment slate on the desk some time ago. He had not picked it up again. He was standing, with his arms crossed, watching the display feeds with the expression of a man who has been walking a very familiar road and has just realized that the road he thought he recognized does not actually go where he believed it did. The small one, he said. Vok. He wasn't distracted during the walk from the docking bay. No, Sercal said. He was listening to the ventilation system. We think so, yes. A pause. During orientation, Veltar said slowly. When I said his file numbers were probably inflated, Sercal said nothing. His file said Special Operations Selection Course. Yes. What does that mean? For humans. Sercal had looked it up during hour 2. She had read the answer 3 times. She had not shared it with the room yet. She shared it now. The room absorbed it in silence. Veltar looked at the display where Vok was sitting beside a ventilation junction, one hand resting lightly on the duct wall, relaying Okoro's coordinates to a woman, moving invisibly through a battlefield that did not know she was in it. He did not say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, to no one in particular, I filed it under miscellaneous. Reyes moved through the scenario wearing the opposition force's own signature. The automated tracking system read her as friendly. The opposition units she passed in the corridor near Sector 5 ignored her because she was, according to every sensor they had, one of them. She was not one of them. She walked to the Pelrin unit first. 4 students who had taken heavy losses and were holding a secondary position with insufficient supply and no viable extraction route. She came in through the service panel, assessed their situation in 30 seconds, left 2 supply units from the depot cache, and told them in clear, direct language exactly what the opposition force's current coordination status was, that it was gone, that the force they were fighting was no longer talking to itself, that the pressure they had been experiencing would drop within the next 20 minutes, and when it did, they should advance, not hold, because the position behind them was about to become more valuable than the position they were defending. The Pelrin unit leader, a student named Keth'Var, decorated in her own service before the exchange, looked at Reyes for a long moment. She looked at the supply units. She looked at the service panel Reyes had come through. You were never in Sector 7, she said. No, Reyes said. You've been in the walls. Yes. Keth'Var looked at her for another moment. Then she said, Are there more of you? 3 of us total. And you've been doing this the whole time. Reyes checked her forearm map. We had about 6 hours of setup before we could do this part. Keth'Var was quiet. Then, what do you need from us? Reyes told her. It was a small thing, a positional hold for 40 minutes at a specific corridor junction that Keth'Var's unit could manage easily given the supply she had just received. Not heroic, not costly, precisely what the unit's resources and position made possible, and precisely what Reyes's logistics picture, built by Okoro, transmitted by Vok, executed by her, required. Keth'Var said yes without hesitation. How did you know we'd say yes? She asked, as Reyes moved back toward the service panel. Reyes paused. I didn't, she said. That's why I told you the truth about what was happening first. She went back through the wall. In the monitoring center, 7 people were watching displays that were showing them something 260 years of simulation data had not prepared them for. The opposition force's effectiveness had dropped to 14%. 39 students in Sector 7 were advancing against a force that was no longer coordinating, and most of them believed they were simply performing well. A few of the more analytically sharp ones had begun noting on their communication channels that the change had been sudden rather than gradual, and were asking whether the scenario parameters had shifted. The scenario parameters had not shifted. The ground had. Veltar on stood at Serkal's station, reading her documentation of the human unit's movements. He read it slowly. He read several sections twice. Then he said, without looking up, "The supply caches, the junction indicators, the ones Reyes marked, on the wall panels." "Yes," Serkal said. "They're accessible to any unit that enters the maintenance corridor network." "Yes," which any unit could do, because the corridors aren't locked. They just aren't on the student map. "Yes." "She built a supply network," he said, "that any student in this scenario can access, that she built in approximately 2 hours, that helps units she will never personally reach." He set the documentation down. "She built infrastructure in a scenario that has never produced infrastructure." He stood with that for a moment. "She's not playing the scenario," he said. "She's building a better one." He said it without inflection. It was not admiration yet. It was the sound of a very organized mind reorganizing itself around an entirely new category. "I told them they would perform in the middle third," he said. Serkal said nothing. "I said the combat numbers were probably inflated." Still nothing. Veltar on picked up his assessment slate. He looked at the notes he had made since the simulation launched. He looked at them for a long time. Then he set the slate back down, face down on the desk. He did not pick it up again that day. At 2200 hours station time, 14 hours into Designation 14, Moss made the call. He had been trying to find a reason to make it for 6 hours. The scenario was not broken. Every system was functioning within normal parameters. The students were healthy. No safety protocols had been triggered. The objective was still technically active, the command node in Sector 7 was still being contested, still generating valid assessment data. None of that was the problem. The problem was that Designation 14 was no longer assessing the students. The students were assessing it. What the monitoring center had been watching for the past 8 hours was not 47 students competing for a scenario objective. It was 47 students operating in a scenario that 3 of them had fundamentally restructured without the other 44 knowing it. The supply caches in the maintenance corridors had been accessed by 3 separate student units in the past 4 hours. The opposition force's effectiveness had stabilized at 14% functionally, defeated not by the students fighting it in Sector 7 but by the systematic removal of its operational infrastructure by 3 people who had never gone to Sector 7. The assessment data from the remaining 39 students in the combat zone was compromised. They were not fighting the scenario they had been placed in. They were fighting a significantly weakened version of it without knowing why, which meant their performance metrics were measuring something the assessment rubric had no framework for. And the 3 humans? The 3 humans had generated performance data that the system's 412 cataloged behavioral metrics could not process. Not because the behaviors were outside the system's physical parameters, because the system had no categories for what it was looking at. There was no metric for building a parallel logistics network inside a live scenario. There was no metric for converting enemy infrastructure into a friendly command center. There was no metric for an unmonitorable communication system built from ventilation components. There was no metric for a signal mask field modified from opposition equipment. There was no metric for identifying and resupplying struggling Allied units as a primary operational objective, not for tactical advantage but because the units needed it and the resources existed. And Reyes had seen both of those facts and connected them. There was no metric, fundamentally, for three students deciding that the most effective response to a scenario was not to compete inside it, but to change the conditions under which everyone else was competing. It was still just a training exercise, except it had stopped being just a training exercise the moment Reyes heard there were no rules, and understood that sentence more completely than the man who said it. Moss called the scenario at 2200 hours. The announcement went out across the student communication network. Designation 14 is suspended. All units return to staging areas. Debrief at 6 o'clock tomorrow. In the maintenance corridors, Vok felt the announcement come through the official channel. He had already felt it through the ventilation system 17 seconds earlier. Okoro had picked it up on the monitoring equipment in the staging room and sent it through the duct network before the broadcast completed. Vok relayed it to Reyes, who was 3 sectors away. She felt the pulse through the junction point she had her hand on, decoded it, stood up straight, checked her forearm. Notation one last time. Then she walked back through the walls to where Okoro and Vok were waiting. In the staging room, Okoro had already started shutting down the command center methodically, component by component, leaving the opposition equipment as he had found it, except for the relay cable which he reconnected before he left. He believed in leaving a space ready for whoever needed it next. Vok was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed. Okoro looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at Vok. "He's actually sleeping," Okoro said. Reyes shook her head slowly, not surprised, not annoyed, the quiet fond disbelief of someone who has known a person long enough to have stopped being surprised by who they are. She crouched down, put her hand briefly on Vok's shoulder. He opened his eyes, looked around, stood up, picked up his kit. Good. The debrief was the quietest Keth'Var had ever conducted. 44 students gathered in the main assessment theater at 6 o'clock. Commandant Doss was present. 3 senior instructors, Moss, Serkel, Veltaron, who had not slept particularly well and showed it in the precise way that someone who is accustomed to certainty shows sleeplessness, not in disarray but in a very specific quality of stillness. The 3 humans sat in the 3rd row. Reyes had her hands folded. Okoro looked like a man who had slept well. Vok was watching the ventilation grate above the room's primary entry door. Moss presented the scenario outcome data. He was thorough and he was accurate. He explained that Designation 14 had been suspended not because any unit had failed to perform but because the scenario's assessment framework had been rendered unable to generate valid data. He explained the specific actions that had caused this. He used a display diagram. He was careful and precise. The room absorbed it in silence. Then the silence did a particular thing. It shifted. It became the silence of rooms, where people are arriving at realizations at different speeds, and the faster ones are waiting for the slower ones to catch up, because some understandings need a moment to find their footing. Keth'Var, the Theric unit leader who had performed best in Sector 7, raised a hand. The opposition forces degraded effectiveness. In the 3rd and 4th hour, she said carefully, we attributed it to our own pressure. That was a reasonable attribution, Moss said, given the information available to you. The information available to us was incomplete. Yes, Keth'Var sat with this. We were fighting a scenario that had already been changed. We thought we were winning because we were Good. But we were winning because something else had removed the difficulty. She paused. We didn't know to look for what we couldn't see. The room was very quiet. That's the actual lesson, said another voice, a Pelrin student from the 4th row, Keth'Var. She was looking at the display, not at Moss, not 14, not this specific scenario. The lesson is that the conditions you're fighting inside can be changed by someone you can't see, and you will not always know it happened, and you need to account for that. She paused. Both directions. The room understood what she meant. Both directions. You need to account for someone changing your conditions against you, and you need to know that you can change the conditions yourself. From the 3rd row, Reyes said nothing. She did not need to. After the main debrief, Commandant Doss asked the 3 human students to remain. When the room had cleared, she sat across from them at the assessment table and looked at each of them in turn. Veltar had remained as well, standing to the left of the door. He had asked to stay. Doss had permitted it. She looked at Reyes. At orientation, she said, you asked Coordinator Moss if there were any rules. Yes, Commandant. He told you there were none, only outcomes. Yes. When he said that in that moment, what did you understand that to mean? Reyes was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer. The quiet of someone making sure the answer was exactly right. It meant, she said, that the objective was the objective, but everything between us and the objective was negotiable. Doss looked at her. Everything, she said. Everything, Reyes confirmed. Doss Vok considered this. It's not that you can't monitor it, he said. It's that you weren't looking at it. There's a difference. Doss sat back. Veltar at the door said nothing. He had been saying very little since the previous evening. He had been, instead, listening with the specific attention of a person who has realized that they have been hearing without listening for a very long time, and is attempting to correct the habit. I want to ask you something, Doss said to Reyes, and I want an honest answer. Yes, Commandant. The units you resupplied, the Pelrins, the others, you gained no positional advantage from helping them. It did not improve your unit standing. It did not accelerate the scenario's resolution. No, Reyes agreed. Then why? Reyes thought about this. Genuinely thought, in the way she approached every question, as though the question deserved to be taken seriously regardless of whether the answer would be convenient. Because they needed it, she said. And we had it. And we were there. A pause. That's usually enough reason. Veltar made a sound that was not quite a word. Not dismissal. Not agreement. The sound of a very organized mind encountering a principle it did not have a category for, and we don't really have a mode for, accepting someone else's definition of the problem, Reyes said. It's not a decision we make. It's just how we're built. Doss left. Veltar waited until her footsteps faded in the corridor. Then he looked at the 3 humans, at Reyes specifically. I told Coordinator Moss your combat experience numbers were probably inflated, he said, that you would likely perform in the middle third of the cohort. We know, Reyes said. You knew at orientation? We assumed. It was consistent with how the files were probably read. He absorbed this. It didn't affect what you planned. Why would it? Koro said, gently, not as a challenge. Someone else's assessment of what we were capable of wasn't information about what we were capable of. It was information about what they expected. That's useful data. It's just a different kind of useful than they intended. Veltaron looked at him for a long moment. You used our underestimation as a resource, he said slowly. We thought we were forming an assessment of you. You were forming an assessment of us. No one confirmed or denied it. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he picked up his assessment slate, the one he had put face down on Serkal's desk and not touched since the previous afternoon, and walked out without another word. The 14 incident was classified at the Academy's highest internal level. Within 72 hours, the classification was not an attempt to suppress what had happened. It was an attempt to protect something. Specifically, it was an attempt to protect the 4,217 years of institutional certainty that Keth'Var had built from the knowledge that 3 students from a species no one had been taking seriously had spent 14 hours demonstrating with quiet and systematic precision exactly what that certainty had been built on. Assumptions. Every century of assessment data, every behavioral metric, every calibrated opposition force parameter, every scenario in the library of 900 built on the reasonable, well-supported, thoroughly evidenced assumption that students would compete within the scenario, that they would want to win on the scenario's terms, that winning on the scenario's terms was the obvious and natural objective. The redesigned assessment scenario, internally designated 14R, officially titled Adaptive Environment Challenge Protocol, was introduced. 18 months later, it included physical parameters that extended to the full maintenance infrastructure of the lower decks. It included opposition force programming with no fixed staging locations. It included a scoring rubric with 61 new behavioral categories, most of them written by Serkal, who had spent the intervening months trying to build a framework that could measure what she had watched. She never got it quite right. She said years later that this was the point. You could not build a metric for a mind that treated every metric as a variable. The most you could do was design the container to be flexible enough that what grew inside it did not break the walls. It was not a perfect solution, but it was an honest one. Veltaron submitted a curriculum review request to Commandant Doss's office 11 days after the incident, covered the Academy's intake, assessment rubric, the pre-scenario, student profiling methodology, and, in a section he had written and rewritten 4 times, a proposal to redesign the orientation briefing, specifically the part where the coordinator explained that there were no rules, only outcomes. His proposal was not to remove the line. His proposal was to mean it more fully, to design the scenario around it, as though some of the students in the room might actually believe it. Doss approved the review. She wrote 1 note in the margin of his proposal. Finally, the 3 humans completed the remainder of their exchange program. They graduated, all 3 of them. They returned to Earth with transcripts bearing Keth'Var's seal and an assessor's notation that read, in the Academy's formal language, a phrase that translated roughly as demonstrated proficiency in adaptive command beyond cataloged parameters. It was the first time that notation had been used in 4,217 years. It would not be the last. Earth received their return with the polite interest it reserved for exchange programs, a brief report filed, a commendation noted, a record updated. Nobody on Earth was particularly surprised. They had known Reyes and Okoro and Vok. For a long time, they knew what Reyes did with a problem she wasn't supposed to solve. They knew what Okoro built when someone handed him a resource inventory and a map. They knew what Vok heard when everyone else was looking. They knew what happened when you put humans in a room and told them there were no rules. The galaxy was still learning. Commandant Doss's private log was discovered by the Academy's archival staff 17 years after the incident, when her tenure concluded, and her records were processed. The log was never intended for anyone else to read. Most of it was operational, administrative notes, curriculum observations, faculty assessments, the standard contents of a long career documented for personal reference. The entry from the night of the 14 incident was 3 paragraphs. The first 2 were questions she was asking herself, the kind of questions that come at the end of a day that has reorganized your understanding of a thing you thought you understood. The third paragraph was this: we have spent 4,000 years teaching officers to master the battlefield. The humans walked in and mastered the assumptions underneath it. We thought we were teaching them to command armies. They showed us we had never learned to command the ground we were standing on, that we had been measuring performance inside a box, never once asking who built the box, why its walls were where they were, or what existed in the space on the other side. They did not arrive with superior weapons. They did not arrive with superior numbers. They arrived with a question we had stopped asking so long ago we had forgotten. It was a question at all. Why does it have to work this way? For 1,000 years, 12,000 students, 41 species, and it took 3 people who had never been here before to remind us that a rule no one questions is not wisdom. It is just a wall that has been standing long enough to look like the horizon.